No, it's great to see you, and I appreciate very much the opportunity to be back in your midst. I really appreciate this church for so many of the good works you support, and one of them is the work at the Memphis School of Preaching. I can't tell you how many students you've helped us with over the years, how many special projects you've helped us with. I just cannot say enough about the friend that the Willette Church of Christ has been to the training of gospel preachers. Thank you, thank you, thank you to the leadership, to all of those members who contribute and make it possible for us to reach out, to train men of God to go out and preach the gospel. Men like Zach, and I'll take 100 students like he was, and Emily too. She was a great student in the Wives program, and have great respect for you, for Jack, and the good work that he does. I'd like to say a lot more, but I got to hurry. I've got a lot to say and a short time to say it. One other quick thing I would ask you to do, only because I believe prayer is very powerful. My lovely wife, Tish, has been battling something that we don't know yet what it is for the last little bit, the last few weeks especially. Loss of strength, brain fog, and she's already been through the COVID paces and things of that nature. This is something else. It's affecting her in so many different ways. She'll see a neurologist in the morning for the first time since all these things have been happening, hoping we can start to get some answers. If you'd pray for her, that would really mean a lot to her and to me. I thank you for it very, very much. Who gets to decide who lives and who dies? I don't have the right to make that decision because I'm not the author of life. The author of life knows who should live and who should die and when they should live or die. And so did he reveal that to us? And the answer is, indeed he did. He wrote it down through his inspired spokesman, Moses. And I want to start there in Genesis chapter 9 and verse 6 with this very foundational principle. Genesis chapter 9 and verse number 6. And may I please remind all of us that these words were not spoken to just the Jewish nation, because the Hebrew nation developed through Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob had not yet arrived. The only people on the planet at the time these words were spoken were Noah and his family, 8 souls. So these words were spoken to, you could say, the entire human race that was present at the time. So this is a universal ordinance. It's not peculiar to any covenant. In the patriarchal age, we see that this was God's plan. And we're going to see that it was part of his plan in the Mosaic age. And then, of course, we have to answer the question, what about the Christian age? In Genesis 9 and verse 6, this is what God said. Whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For in the image of God made he man. There it is. True or false? Almighty God, the author of life, said there is a time when it is permissible, in fact, one would even say commanded, for mankind to take the life of another man because that man took someone else's life. Does the Bible say in Genesis 9:6 that there is ever a time in the eyes of God that would be permissible to take someone who's murdered someone else and to shed their blood as a consequence of their action? Yes or no? It's there in the text. I didn't write it. I don't apologize for it. I accept it. Genesis 9:6, whoever it is. Notice, whoso sheddeth man's blood, by man shall his blood be shed. For what's the reason? We do not take someone if they are involved in the slaying of an animal and put them to death. Why would we put them to death when they slay another human being? Because the difference between the human being and the animal is, verse 6, in the image of God made he man. No animal was made in the image of God. If you don't believe there's a difference between an animal and a human being, let me ask you this question. Have you ever been driving down the road and seen a dead dog or a dead animal on the side of the highway? I'm sure you have. And you might have felt a little sympathy well up in you for that poor animal, and I understand that too. Did you stop and call 911 and wait for the ambulance to get there? Of course not. Let me ask you, if you're driving down the road and you happen to glance over on the right-hand side of the road and there's not an animal there, there's a human being all curled up, would you just say, "Oh, poor thing," and keep driving? You know. You would stop, you would call someone, you would try to summon the authorities, because why? It reminds me of this story that I heard about a man that was on a cruise ship, and he had his pet dog with him that he treated like a human being. And he called his dog Freddie. And he was giving Freddie a walk around the deck. And Freddie saw something in the water that really got his attention. And Freddie squirmed out of his owner's arms and went plunging into the ocean. Well, the man ran to the captain and said, "You've got to turn this ship around. Freddie fell overboard. Freddie fell overboard." And the captain, thinking that Freddie was a man, started making preparations to turn around to try to come back. And then the man said, "I had just given Freddie his last dog biscuit when he wiggled out of my arms and plunged into the water below." And the captain said, wait a minute. Freddie is a dog?" "Yes, sir." "Sir, I know you love your dog, but I'm sorry, I cannot turn this ship around for a dog. It takes 20 minutes to make a circle in this big ocean liner, and we're going to miss connections, and this is going to really complicate matters of travel for other people. I cannot turn this ship around for a dog. I'm so sorry." He says, "You won't turn this ship around for a dog?" He said, "No, sir." And Freddie's owner jumped overboard and started swimming toward Freddie, knowing that ship's going to turn around now, because I'm not a dog. I'm a human being. And listen, there's something about a human being, human life, that is so precious because it was made in the image of God. And so to take that life is indeed a consequential matter. Now, has God ever enacted the death penalty? Friends, in this very same book, in fact, the event that led up to the passage we've just read in Genesis 9:6, you'll notice that there was a worldwide flood. And if you've ever wondered if God would ever approve of people dying as a consequence of their actions, all you need do is read Genesis and see that the flood was God's consequence for man's sinfulness, and he had pleaded with them through Noah the preacher. In fact, some forget Enoch, the great-grandfather of Noah, had been sent to preach and to warn the people even before Noah did, according to Jude verses 14 and 15. So no one could say God didn't give us any warnings, he didn't give us any time. Friends, God did practice the death penalty in the book of Genesis. And so I cannot say that it's out of character for God to do so. I want you to go now to the book of Exodus. Go to Exodus chapter 21. Exodus chapter 21. And notice, if you will, please, verse number 12. Now, this is not the patriarchal age anymore. We're now shifting into the Mosaic age, where God is speaking through Moses and Aaron to the tribal heads, who will then pass it on to the tribes. They're all governed by this legislation, and they are there at Mount Sinai and in these chapters preceding this. And notice verse number 12. "He that smiteth a man so that he die shall be surely put to death." But God, what about those occasions where it might not be an intentional, premeditated murder? God covers that. Look at verse 13. "If a man lie not in wait," he's not already planning this, lurking, waiting to pounce. No, he lies not in wait, but God delivers him into his hand, then I'll appoint thee a place whither he shall flee. There would be cities of refuge where an accidental death could be mitigated by a judge, adjudicated by a judge, and they could look it over and see what the situation was. But notice verse 14. But if a man come presumptuously upon his neighbor to slay him with guile, then what? Thou shalt take him from mine altar that he may die. So death penalty offense, yes, the law of Moses contained death penalty offenses. Just take a brief survey of this chapter to see some of them. You'll notice in verse number 15, under the law of Moses at least, if you smote your father or your mother, that was a death penalty offense. If you stole a man, if you kidnapped or involved yourself in human trafficking and sold that individual, or if that person you kidnapped was still in your possession serving your interest, that was a death penalty offense under the law of Moses, verse 16. Verse 17, even if you cursed your father or your mother, that was a death penalty offense under the law of Moses. And then he talks about two men striving together, and one of them smites the other with a stone or with his fist, and he doesn't die, but he's bedfast. If he does get up again, verse 19, and he walks abroad upon his staff, then shall he that smote him be quit. He'll be acquitted of murder. He won't be acquitted of the action, though, of injuring the man. Notice, he shall pay for the loss of his time and shall cause him to be he's thoroughly healed. He'll pay his medical expenses. That's right. And then you'll note verse number 20. If a man smite his servant or is made with a rod, and that servant dies in the process, he shall surely be punished. And then you'll notice in Exodus chapter 20, well, let's, for time's sake, go on to Leviticus. We're going to have to go quicker. Go to Leviticus, if you will, please. I want you to zoom in, if you will, on Leviticus chapter 20. Leviticus chapter 20. And note here that he says in verse number 2, again thou shalt say to the children of Israel, whosoever he be of the children of Israel, or of the strangers that sojourn in Israel, that giveth any of his seed unto Molech. What does that mean? Some of these people would actually offer their own children as sacrifices to idol gods in an attempt to appease those gods to receive blessings. If they did that, God said, he shall be surely put to death. Last part of verse 2. The people of the land shall stone him with stones. And so God made it abundantly clear. Now, if you turned to witches or familiar spirits or wizards back then and involved yourself in spiritual adultery and idolatry, God says he would cut that person off from among the people. And then you'll notice in verse number 9 of Leviticus 20, everyone that curses his father or his mother shall surely be put to death. And then verse 10, the man that commits adultery with another man's wife, even he that committeth adultery with his neighbor's wife, both the adulterer and the adulteress shall surely be put to death. And then you go down Leviticus chapter 20, and you'll notice all these other sexual sins that are discussed there that were death penalty offenses. So you cannot read the book of Leviticus and not see that God is indeed someone that authorized and even practiced the death penalty. Look at Leviticus 24, if you will. Leviticus 24. What if we find someone blaspheming the name of the Lord? Look at verse 16 of Leviticus 24. He that blasphemeth the name of the Lord, what? He shall surely be put to death. All the congregation shall certainly stone him. Verse number 17, he that killeth any man shall surely be put to death. And so on and so forth. You can read the rest of that there. Now let's move to the book of Numbers. Let's go to chapter 15 of the book of Numbers. And notice, if you will, please, Numbers chapter 15, zoom in on verse number 32. The children of Israel are out in the wilderness, and they found a man gathering sticks upon the Sabbath day. God had clearly legislated not to do those things, but here's a man that was doing it. They found him gathering sticks on the Sabbath day. So they brought him to Moses and Aaron. They didn't know exactly how to handle this, so they put him in ward, verse 34, because it was not declared what should be done to him. And the Lord said, this is not Moses and Aaron putting their heads together uninspired and saying, what do you think we ought to do, Aaron? Well, what do you think we ought to do, Moses? God, what do you say? God told Moses and Aaron in verse 35, the man shall be surely put to death. All the congregation shall stone him with stones without the camp. And all the congregation brought him without the camp, stoned him with stones, and he died as the Lord commanded Moses. So was God in favor of the death penalty? And on certain occasions, very next chapter, number 16, we see the rebellion of Cora, Dathon, and Abiram and how they were dealt with. The earth swallowed them up. It was a death penalty offense. If you'll go to the book of Numbers chapter 35. Numbers 35. Please note here that God is about to give some legislation about those cities of refuge. And he tells them where to put these cities. Now what are these cities for? Look at verse 15. These 6 cities shall be a refuge, both for the children of Israel, for the stranger, for the sojourner, that every one that killeth any person unawares may flee thither. In other words, he didn't intend to kill him. He wasn't planning to kill him. It wasn't a premeditated event. But notice verse 16. If he smite him with an instrument of iron so that he die, he's a murderer. He had a weapon. He took that weapon and smote him with it deliberately and premeditated. The murderer, what's his consequence? Shall surely be put to death. But what if verse number 19, the revenger of blood himself shall slay the murderer? But notice here, he mentions there later on in this text that there are occasions where it might be done unintentionally. Those occasions, one would go to the city of refuge and the judge would determine there what should be done. But notice there was no exception to the rule of killing the murderer in this occasion. He says in verse number 31 of Numbers 35, you shall take no satisfaction for the life of a murderer, meaning no financial compensation or payment. He shall be surely put to death. You do not ignore this and decide to change my rule on this. Now go to the book of Deuteronomy, the very next book. And you might be saying, Brother Clarke, I don't think we're going to be able to make it through all 66. No, we're not. I just want to show you a couple of things from Deuteronomy. We're going to fast forward to the New Testament and make some applying principles there. In Deuteronomy chapter 13, you will notice that if your brother, verse 6, if your brother, I'm talking your own flesh and blood brother, the son of your mother, or your son, your daughter, the wife of thy bosom, your friend that's like your best friend, if any of those folks come to you and say, let's go serve other gods. Come on, let's go serve other gods. Here's what you do, verse 8. Thou shalt not consent unto him, nor hearken unto him, neither be easier if he said, you don't give in, but then keep it to yourself. No, he said, you're not allowed to keep this to yourself. Neither shall thine eye pity him, neither shalt thou spare, neither shalt thou conceal him. This is a death penalty offense. Someone trying to get a family member to come with them to serve idol gods would be spiritually deadly, and so the punishment for it had to be deadly as well. Thou shalt surely kill him. Thine hand shall be first upon him to put him to death, and then afterwards the hand of all the people. Look at Deuteronomy 17. Deuteronomy chapter 17. He says there in verse number 2, you get word that someone in your gates has gone, verse 3, and served other gods and worshiped them, and you've been told about it, verse 4, and you've inquired diligently, and you've made sure the thing is true, it's certain, it really did happen. This, by the way, shows you that God's view is, no, you don't just take people that might be innocent or might not be innocent and put them to death and hope for the best. You make sure of the evidence, and once the evidence has been made sure, and it's, notice verse 4, certain. The thing is certain. It's beyond reasonable doubt. It's true. Then what? Then you bring forth, verse 5, that man or that woman, which has committed that wicked thing, even that man, or yes, even if it's a woman, shalt stone them with stones till they die. Now watch God's wisdom here in verse 6. No one was allowed to be put to death if there was only one witness. How wise is that? Because if one man has it out for another man, and only one witness is required for someone to be put to death, then this one witness could lie about this man and say he did something that was a death penalty offense. And if he did not do it, there wouldn't be any way to reverse it. If they put him to death at the testimony of one man, no. The Bible says, verse 6, at the mouth of 2 or 3 witnesses shall he that is worthy of death be put to death. At the mouth of one witness he shall not be put to death. You make sure that you have the evidence and that he's truly guilty. Verse 7, the hands of the witnesses shall be first upon him to put him to death, and afterward the hands of all the people. Now here's what I want you to watch. Some people say that the death penalty has no positive benefits. It does not deter, we're told by some. And we'll talk quickly in a moment about why that may be the case in America, the way it's practiced here. But others have said, if there's no deterrent, then why do it? Look at, what's the last statement of verse 7? So thou shalt put the evil away from among you. Let me ask you, if you've got cancer in just one little small portion of your body, but it's an aggressive cancer, would you be willing to let them cut a portion of your flesh out of your body to try to get rid of that cancer? Some of you sitting in this room have probably allowed them to cut into your face where something was growing, or on your neck or some part of your body where there was cancer growing, and you allowed them to cut a hunk of your flesh out of you. That's pretty drastic. Well, I have a relative through my wife's family. Her twin sister's son got osteosarcoma. It's in his left leg. If they don't do something, it's going to spread to the other parts of his body and take his life. They ended up amputating a portion of that leg from below the thigh down. That's drastic. Why would you let someone cut your leg off? Because the threat that's inside that small section of the body is not going to stay there. It's going to spread to other parts of the body. And yes, it's drastic, but this will preserve the rest of the body. Were there times when God would say that you need to put this evil away from among you in society? Because if you let that continue to live in your midst, it's going to what? It's going to spread. And it's going to do deadly damage. Sometimes the Bible says the death penalty is for getting rid of the evil that is in the midst of the people so that it does not spread. Notice, if you will, please, in Deuteronomy chapter 19 and verse 19. Deuteronomy 19:19. He says, then shall you do unto him as he had thought to have done unto his brother. And what would be the benefit of that? So shalt thou put the evil away from among you. That's part of the benefit of this disciplinary action. It puts the evil away from your midst. Look at Deuteronomy chapter 21 and verse 21. Deuteronomy 21:21. You'll note here, if this son is such a rebellious, stubborn son, he will not obey. He's a glutton, he's a drunkard, he's just out of control. And he's spreading this action everywhere he goes and bringing others into the vortex of his life, and it's harming other people. Verse 21, what? All the men of the city? Stone him with stones that he die. What would be the benefit of that? So shalt thou put evil away from among you. But then we hear, oh no, there's no deterrent. There's no deterrent factor to the death penalty. Would you look at the next phrase? God says there is. Last phrase of verse 21, and all Israel shall hear and fear. Go back to Deuteronomy 13 and look at verse 11. In the verses following the command to stone that individual stones that tried to get someone to go and be an idolater with them, what would be the benefit of that? Verse 11 of Deuteronomy 13. All Israel shall hear and what? Fear and what? Shall do no more any such wickedness as this is among you. It will have a deterrent effect. Ananias and Sapphira, why were they struck dead by God in Acts chapter 5? To create a deterrent, to cause fear to come upon the congregation so that they would think twice before they lied. It had that effect. Nadab and Abihu, Uzzah. There were death penalty occasions when God was trying to send a message to the rest of the folks. Now, I want you to notice, if you will, please, some New Testament events. Let's go to the New Testament, because here's the sad argument that I hear some people making. Well, yeah, in the Old Testament, God was mean. But between Malachi and Matthew, he got nice and decided that he would take away that death penalty stuff. That Jesus taught us to love one another, and yes, so is that command found in the Old Testament as well. I want you to notice, if you will, please, in the book of Luke, chapter 19. If you want to know whether Jesus would ever teach something about death penalty offenses, look at Luke chapter 19 and zoom in on verse number 27. At the end of the parable of the pounds, this is Jesus talking. But those mine enemies which would not that I should reign over them, bring hither and do what? Slay them before me. Next chapter, Luke chapter 20, and this is in the parable of the vineyards. The man plants a vineyard and they start beating up the servants and those in charge of the vineyard, and they end up killing the son. Verse number 16, Jesus says, Luke 20 and 16, he shall come and destroy these husbandmen and shall give the vineyard to others. And so Jesus on this occasion purports that a death penalty occasion can occur in a justified fashion. Go to Acts 25. Paul, would you weigh in on this with it, please? In the New Testament age, I mean, we know about the patriarchal age, we know about the Mosaic age, but in the Christian age, God wouldn't have death penalty permission, right? Well, let's see about it. Acts 25, here's verse 11. The Apostle Paul, standing before Porcius Festus, says this. Verse 11, Acts 25, for if I be an offender or have committed anything worthy of death, well, you can't kill me because the death penalty is now wrong. So there. Is that what your Bible says? What it says instead is this. If I'm an offender and I've committed anything worthy of death, this is an inspired man acknowledging there are things that you could do that would be worthy of what? Worthy of death, even in the New Testament age, yes. And he said, if I've done anything worthy of death, I would not refuse to die. but I haven't done anything worthy of death. Paul, did you ever write about this in any of your epistles? Look at Romans chapter 13. In Romans chapter 13, you will notice that in these verses at the beginning of the chapter, Paul writes and says that we ought to be subject unto the higher powers, those governmental powers they're ordained of God. And if you resist the authority of the government, you're resisting the ordinance of God. Of course, the exception to that rule is we ought to obey God rather than men. But notice verse 3. Rulers are not a terror to good works, but to the evil. Verse 4. He, that's the minister of God, the government, the powers that be are intended to be minister of God to thee for good. Now, the abuse of a system doesn't mean the system itself was flawed. Men sometimes mess up what God designed, but the way God designed it, government is supposed to be a beneficial thing. For example, verse 4. If you do what's evil, don't worry about it, Paul says. The New Testament age doesn't allow the death penalty anymore, so you've got nothing to fear. You can go out and do anything you want. Nuh-uh. If you do that which is evil, be afraid. Why not? Or why should I? For he beareth not the sword in vain. He, the government, the minister of God, a revenger to execute wrath upon him that doeth evil. So wait a minute, Paul, you're saying that the government has the right to bear the sword? Yes. Against wrongdoers? Yes. To execute wrath? Yes. Against evildoers? That's right. Someone tell me, the sword, is that to tickle you with? Or to give you a little poke and say, just let that be a lesson to you? If it gets to this point and the government's bringing out the sword, it's to kill you. It's to kill. You know, it's at this point that someone says, but Jesus said, turn the other cheek. And Paul earlier in Romans 12 says that we're not to return evil for evil. And verse 17, recompense to no man evil for evil. And if it's possible, as much as lies within you, live peaceably with all men. Dearly beloved, avenge not yourselves, but rather give place to wrath. It's written, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. In both the Matthew 5 text and this text, we know what it can't mean. It can't mean that all capital punishment is wrong, because, my friends, on this occasion, Paul then goes right into a discussion. He would be Jekyll and Hyde if in chapter 12 he says, now, you can't execute vengeance at all, ever. And then in chapter 13 he says, the government can. Now, friends, the government can. Individual vigilantism, personal retaliation, and vendettas are what's condemned in Matthew 5 and Romans 12. But if the government with solid evidence does appoint a guilty man to die, that is not anti-God. It is approved of by God. As I close out this part of the message, I want to remind us of something that is so important, and I'll say more about this during the invitation. It's very important to remember that the church today in the New Testament is not under the law of Moses. And so, no, we're not looking at those sins they committed that were physical death penalty offenses then and executing people physically. We have no biblical authority to do that in the New Testament age. The church does have the right, does have the obligation to practice church discipline, to try to wake up an adulterous individual like 1 Corinthians 5, who was committing fornication with his father's wife, presumably a stepmother. And the church at Corinth was patting themselves on the back about tolerating this in their midst. No, they were told to put that evil away from among them. And it would cause others to see that sin is a serious proposition. So though we have no death penalty offense physically, the Lord's church does have a means whereby to warn people to avoid the ultimate death penalty, which is the second death penalty. The second death is the lake of fire and brimstone. It's very important that we not forget that the ultimate death penalty was overcome by the ultimate death, the death of Jesus Christ our Lord, about which I'll say more during the invitation.